Yeah, it was just your boy Ambassador doing this. Thank just my opinion. I'm giving my opinion. I hope that you give your opinion in the comment section. Like, share, subscribe. We need to build that critical mass. We need to get people thinking. Today I'll be talking about something which is a very sensitive topic, given that it's one of those countries that I've visited the most. Yes, the country I visited the most out of my country, because I don't visit my country. So it's the country I visited the most. South Africa. I've gone there like 5-6 times in the recent years. And each time I go there, I remember the first time I go there, I told my younger brother, I cannot live in this place. Because for some reason, the way I'm built, certain things just affect me differently. So I would see the level of poverty and extreme wealth and extreme poverty in Cape Town especially. And then I come back home and maybe others, it's okay, they sleep, they're used to it, that's life, they move on. I just keep thinking about it and it's not adding up. And I'm internalizing these things and it's disturbing me more than normal. So, this particular discussion, I'll just call it why we should worry about South Africa. Each time I go there, things are deteriorating and it's getting worse. And then I came upon this video where the guy was breaking down the history of South Africa, why it is the way it is, and what it may become if nothing is done about what it is right now.
How did white South Africans get so wealthy? South Africa is the most unequal society in the world. And it freaks me out how many South Africans complain about BEE, or they say 30 years of democracy, isn't that enough for you? In exactly that accent. And how little most South Africans know about economic apartheid. How far colonial and apartheid governments went to lift up white people and suppress people of color for hundreds of years. The simple truth is, black economic empowerment is nothing compared to white economic empowerment. Your parents may have worked hard, very hard, but the paler their skin, the more they benefited from extraordinary government economic aid. And here's when old people say, oh no, but what about this black person who's wealthy or this black person who's made a lot of money? But here's the thing, right? Bad systems always hide behind miracle cases, the radical exceptions that make it out of a bad system even though it doesn't support them at all. They try to make it look like the exception, the miracle, is the average person in the system. And everybody who doesn't make it, well, that's their fault. It's not the system's fault. So here's the issue with white economic empowerment: how white people benefited from extraordinary government economic intervention. You know that speaking about apartheid is hard. So much of it happened off the record, people dispute it. So I'm going to make this super simple. All I'm going to do is tell you about a handful of apartheid policies that were enacted on the record, no doubt about it, that advantaged white people and oppressed black people. So let's start in 1910, when the Union of South Africa was formed. Literally, the country was invented for the first time, and government policies affected everybody in the country. The Second South African War had just ended. It was between the Brits and the Boers, and the Brits won. But they wanted to unite all white people together, especially Afrikaners, because they'd been fighting each other and killing each other for years. And so immediately, they made it that no people of color could vote. Instantly, unite the white people, only they can vote, only they can control the making of the new country. Then in 1913, the Land Act made it illegal, impossible for black people to own land outside of reserves. That meant 93% of all land in South Africa was only available to white people. Then, in the early 1920s, poor white Afrikaners protested that most of big industry was dominated by British companies, and those companies were hiring skilled black workers over them. In response, the government funded enormous public works programs, like building the Hartbeespoort Dam, and they only hired poor white workers. They literally made programs to make jobs for poor white, particularly Afrikaner workers. Also in 1925, the Wage Act made a minimum wage for white workers but not black workers, and the government offered incentives to companies applying for tenders. The more white workers you employ, the more likely you are to win work. Let's jump to 1948, when the National Party returns to power and formalizes apartheid for the very first time. And the first thing they do is direct massive funding to social programs and welfare grants for poor white people, and slashed funding for people of color across the board. In 1950, the Group Areas Act stopped black people from moving through South Africa freely. They had to get permission to go places, always on white people's terms, and this made it incredibly hard to find work. In the 1950s and 60s, the apartheid government fixed black people's pensions, which meant that as inflation increased, the value of those pensions got less. At the same time, white people's pensions increased dramatically. Black South Africans were forced into the Bantu Education Act in 1953, where they were literally only taught how to do basic unskilled labor. They were reduced to servitude. The Nats worked incredibly hard to promote white, specifically Afrikaner-owned business. You know why the Nats had African language radio stations through the SABC? To make money for white people off of black people. In the 60s, the apartheid government handed out millions of radios and ran the African language stations themselves. Obviously, they used it for propaganda to try and control the flow of information around apartheid, but they also gave ad space, reaching this massive new audience to white, especially Afrikaner-owned businesses at knockdown rates. And some of the biggest companies in South Africa today started that way. Afrikaner-owned, benefiting from ad space on African language radio stations that the apartheid government handed them. I could go on, you get the point. And you know what I said earlier about the average experience showing what the system actually does? Well, let's look at what the apartheid system did to South Africa. In 1996, the first ever truly national census was taken, where all South Africans were asked what the reality of their lives were like. Because of apartheid, the 1996 census found that 21% of black South Africans lived in informal housing. That's over 6 million people. And you know how many white South Africans lived in informal housing in 1996? 0.1%. More than 7 million black South Africans in 1996 had no access to piped water. 97% of white South Africans had access to piped water. Let's talk about refuse removal. 59% of black South Africans had no access to regular refuse removal in 1996, more than 18 million people. 92% of white South Africans had access. Electricity. 56% of black South Africans had no access to electricity in 1996 at all, more than 17 million people. 99.6% of all white South Africans had good access to electricity. That is the reality that economic apartheid created in this country.
So he went into things like the historical bias of the various, should I call it, stumbling blocks the black population has had to face, like the Land Act, the Public Work Program, the Wage Act, the Welfare Grant, the Group Failure Act. All of this is even the Bantu Educational System Act, or the Bantu Education Act, was strategically put in place to crumble/handicap the black population. So his concluding lines was more in the direction of there were weaknesses that were intentionally put. They were saying that that's like the most perfectly built system, but too bad it was built for a negative purpose. But the apartheid system was well scripted and planned to have with very clear objectives and intentions, which still today, if you don't study very clearly what were the problems put in place or some of the viruses put in the black system to crumble them, just by making a good speech and people are clapping or giving everybody 20 million francs on the street, will not solve the problem. Because you see the poverty, that was a systemic poverty, which was, there were various layers and levels to it, which if you don't solve those various layers and levels, you give the black people 20 million, it will just make them more alcohol to drink, more violence, more recklessness, more HIV, and those things that come with it. So also there was that weakness in the system. There was also the failure of corrupt policies. So even when they try to make corrective measures, these measures don't work because of corruption and those who enjoy the advantages of that weakness or those weaknesses in the system. So they use corrupt practices to sabotage some of those policies which are intended as corrective measures. Also, as an African, I always say that in all of my videos, as an African, we as Africans have so much to lose if South Africa goes down. For me, South Africa is the most successful model of capitalism in Africa. Nigeria might be the biggest population. I also say that we as Africans have to all support Nigeria, because if Nigeria goes through, that's the biggest black population which can back every African around this world. But South Africa is the strongest capital intensive system or strong demonstration of the capitalist system where the African has succeeded. Although I put it African in quote because is it really the African that succeeded in South Africa? Discussion for another day. Also, we have things like the informal housing system. social immunities, where he mentioned the fact that okay, black neighborhoods are the statistics of them not having basic things like running water, light. Why is there that discrepancy between what happens in the black neighborhoods and the white neighborhoods? 20 years down the line, I did not have light for 10 hours every day. Hence, I could not read at night. Then I'm now a stark illiterate. What policy will you put in place to correct that destructive policy that sabotaged my education and my way of thinking for the last 20 years? Is there a policy which you can fix in the next 10 years? I think it's like, what, 30 years since apartheid came to an end, but we still see some of the, should I call it, relics or what was left over from apartheid still killing the black population. And at times they don't even know, because the worst enemy is the one within. I don't mean within like within South Africa, I mean within like within the people. Because psychologically, when you are broken down as a man, you could be very strong physically, but you are very weak, because it's the spirit that pushes the muscle, that pushes the body. So if the spirit is broken down, then the muscle cannot really do much and the body cannot do much. So with that being said, also, it was a system that broke them at various levels. A very shallow surface. I don't want to insult what BEE stands for, that's a Black Economic Empowerment. But I feel like there's a mismatch. So the strategic and the evil intensity of the apartheid system has to be matched when it comes to the intensity of the BEE system. If the BEE system intends to correct the ills of the apartheid system, if that makes sense. So I feel like it is very short, very shallow. It's a very good system, the BEE system, but it is far from enough. That's why we have 30 years and we are still seeing some of these challenges. So the BEE system has to strategically study what apartheid did in a destructive sense, and then put corrective measures that address each and every one of these destructive policies that were put in place. I've listed a few of them here. They need to be studied and then effort put behind it. But as usual, at times we are still waiting for some of the international organizations or your white brothers to write some of those policies. First, maybe some of you don't even want to read. I'm not trying to say that South Africans don't go to school, but we know the reality. Africans as a whole, some of the people we send to go and negotiate some of these things for us are not the best foot we are putting forward. They're not the sharpest minds. So when they get to those policies, they don't even explore they don't explore in depth what this policy meant and what it did. So as usual, I just tell you guys, I'm bringing up some of these things just to get people thinking. But as an African, I think we need to think and we need to act. But the first step is thinking, and I'm trying to build that critical mass from my end. At one point, I felt like there was nothing I can do. At one point, I told myself, no, there's something you can do. Just start putting out these things and talking about these things. Even if 2 people just listen to it and 2 people react to it. Those are 2 people who also make 2 videos and then 2 people listen, and then that's how it grows. So, but I just have to put it out there. If that's the last thing I do, or is it the least thing I do? As usual, it's your boy Ambassador asking you guys to like, share, subscribe, get more people on board talking about this thing. And then hopefully we can build a critical mass. Ambassador, I'm out.
Just my opinion.